They laughed the moment he walked in. A poor man in worn shoes, a quiet figure in a ballroom of crystal chandeliers and glittering gowns. Everyone whispered, some smirked, a few laughed outright. They thought he didn't belong. They thought he was invisible. But in just minutes, everything changed. The man they mocked became the reason the room stood up, the reason respect was redefined, the reason everyone realized that appearances deceive. This is not a story about wealth or poverty. It's about patience, perseverance, and integrity. It's about the moment when the overlooked becomes the undeniable. Watch closely. Because the man they laughed at will make them rise. The night the city gathered under chandeliers and crystal lights was meant to celebrate wealth, success, and status. The ballroom of the Grand Marembe Hotel shimmered with polished floors, expensive perfumes, and laughter that echoed like confidence. This was not a place where struggle belonged. This was where power greeted power, where names carried weight, and where appearances decided respect. The guests arrived in luxury cars, dressed in tailored suits and glittering gowns, their conversations filled with investments, titles, and influence. In this carefully curated world, poverty was an idea people discussed at charity events, not something they expected to stand beside. Then the doors opened again. A man stepped in quietly, wearing worn shoes and a simple jacket that had seen too many seasons. His posture was humble, his gaze steady but cautious, as if he were aware that he did not belong to this world of glass and gold. Conversations slowed, then twisted into whispers. Eyes followed him with curiosity first, then with poorly hidden amusement. A few guests smiled politely, others smirked openly. Someone laughed, not loudly enough to be called cruel, but just loud enough to be noticed. The man paused, feeling the weight of the room settle on his shoulders, a familiar weight he had carried his entire life. His name was Kofi Mensah, and he had not entered this place by accident. To those watching, he was an intruder in a polished dream. To himself, he was a witness returning to a past he had never truly escaped. Years ago, Kofi had known halls like these from the outside, standing at the gates of opportunity, watching people who never questioned their right to enter. Life had taught him patience, not privilege. He had learned to walk forward even when laughter followed behind him. A server approached, uncertain, asking if he needed assistance. Kofi smiled gently and said he was here for the anniversary celebration of the Lumumba Foundation. The server nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Around them, the party continued, but the room's attention had already shifted. The poor man in worn shoes had become the night's quiet spectacle. Across the hall, Amarine Glovu stood with her friends, a glass of sparkling drink in her hand, her laughter soft but sharp-edged. She noticed Kofi and raised an eyebrow, her curiosity tinted with disbelief. She remembered him faintly from years ago, from a neighborhood she had long outgrown. To her, he represented a life she had escaped. The idea that he stood here, among wealth and power, felt absurd. She leaned closer to her friends, whispering something that made them chuckle. Kofi saw the gesture. He did not flinch. He had seen that look before. Yet he walked forward. Each step felt deliberate, as though he were crossing an invisible line between worlds. The laughter behind him faded into murmurs. People made space for him, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty. He reached the center of the hall and stopped near the stage where speeches would soon begin. The host, noticing the shift in energy, hesitated, then resumed greeting guests, unaware that the atmosphere had quietly begun to change. Kofi looked around the room, taking in the symbols of success that once intimidated him. He did not envy them anymore. Time and hardship had reshaped his desires. He was not here to impress anyone. He was here because this night marked a turning point, one that would reveal how quickly judgment can crumble when truth walks into the light. In the shadows of laughter and polished smiles, fate was preparing its moment. The guests did not yet know it, but the story of this night would be remembered not for the wealth that gathered under crystal lights, but for the man they laughed at before they stood up to honor him. Kofi stood quietly near the edge of the stage while the celebration continued around him, the music softening into background noise as conversation swelled and ebbed like restless waves. He felt the glances sliding over him, some filled with curiosity, others with faint ridicule. The room had already placed him into a story that required no questions. A poor man had wandered into a world that was not his. In halls like these, perception often mattered more than truth. Kofi had learned that long ago, when he used to stand outside glass buildings and imagine what it felt like to be welcomed inside without hesitation. The Lumumba Foundation's anniversary was meant to honor donors, partners, and influential figures who had supported development projects across the region. Speeches were prepared, names were printed on banners, and applause was scheduled into the evening's rhythm. Yet none of the planners had anticipated the presence of someone who did not fit neatly into the narrative of success. Kofi's appearance unsettled the invisible hierarchy of the room, and people grew subtly uncomfortable, unsure whether to acknowledge him or ignore him into invisibility. Amari Ndlovu continued to observe him from a distance, her expression shifting between curiosity and dismissal. Years ago, she and Kofi had lived in the same neighborhood, a place of narrow streets and shared struggles. She remembered him as the quiet boy who helped his mother carry water from the well, the boy who dreamed of leaving but never seemed to. To see him here now, in this polished hall of privilege, disturbed the order of the story she had told herself about escaping that life. If he could be here, what did that say about the distance she believed she had traveled? As the host announced the beginning of formal proceedings, guests took their seats. The music dimmed, the lights softened, and attention shifted toward the stage. Kofi remained standing, his presence unacknowledged, as though he were part of the decor rather than a guest. A few people exchanged glances, debating silently whether he belonged here at all. Security watched from a distance, uncertain but waiting for a cue that never came. The first speaker praised the generosity of donors, the elegance of the evening, and the importance of partnership between wealth and goodwill. Applause followed, polite and practiced. Kofi listened with a calm that surprised even himself. He did not resent these people for their comfort. He resented only the ease with which they believed comfort was proof of worth. As names were read and applause rose and fell, Kofi's memory drifted back to nights spent studying by candlelight, to mornings when hunger sharpened his focus, to years when he was invisible to institutions that claimed to serve people like him. Those memories did not harden him, they steadied him. They reminded him why he had returned to a room that did not recognize him. He was not here to be seen as rich or poor. He was here to be seen as human. Then the host announced a special segment, hinting at a recognition that would honor a partner whose contribution had transformed the foundation's work in ways few had anticipated. The room leaned forward, curiosity ignited by the promise of revelation. Amari felt a strange tightening in her chest, as if something she had not prepared for was about to happen. Her gaze drifted again to Kofi, standing quietly in the half-light near the stage, his worn shoes grounded on polished marble. The host spoke of anonymous support that had sustained clinics, funded scholarships, and rebuilt communities after disaster. Murmurs rippled through the audience as people tried to guess the name behind the generosity. Donors glanced at one another, calculating recognition and influence. The rhythm of the evening shifted. The laughter that once framed the room receded, replaced by anticipation. Kofi took a slow breath. This was the moment he had prepared for, not in speeches rehearsed aloud, but in resolve shaped by years of being overlooked. He did not step forward yet. He waited. The room had to arrive at the truth on its own, even if it resisted at first. He knew that when the truth finally stood under the chandeliers, it would not need his defense. And in that brief, heavy pause before the name was revealed, the guests remained unaware that the story they had written about the man in worn shoes was about to collapse under the weight of a truth they could no longer laugh away. The pause before the name was announced stretched longer than anyone expected, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The host glanced at the card in his hand, then up at the audience, letting anticipation thicken the air. People leaned forward, their earlier amusement replaced by curiosity sharpened with self-interest. In halls like these, recognition carried weight. Being named meant power, and power reshaped how respect was distributed. The host spoke slowly, describing the partner not as a corporation or a wealthy patron, but as an individual whose contributions had been quiet, consistent, and intentionally hidden. He spoke of scholarships that had reached children no one noticed, of clinics built in regions the maps barely mentioned, of emergency funds released in moments when bureaucracy would have delayed help. With each sentence, the audience's assumptions wavered. This did not sound like the work of those who sought applause. This sounded like someone who understood absence because he had once lived within it. Amari felt her breath catch as recognition stirred within her, not of a name yet, but of a pattern. The stories being told echoed the values she remembered from the boy who used to help neighbors without expecting gratitude, the boy who shared what little he had without calling it generosity. She looked again at Kofi. He stood with the same stillness she remembered, as though he were waiting for a storm to pass. The room, however, had begun to shift around him. Eyes that once skimmed over him now lingered with uncertainty, sensing that their first judgment might have been shallow. The host finally spoke the name. Kofi Mensah. The syllables traveled through the hall like a ripple across still water. For a second, no one reacted. The name did not match the image people had constructed. Then confusion rose in soft waves. Heads turned. Whispers collided. Some guests glanced toward the stage, others toward the man in worn shoes standing near it. Struggling to reconcile the two, the host gestured gently toward Kofi, inviting him forward. Kofi stepped into the light. The chandeliers caught the edges of his jacket, revealing its age, its careful mending, the quiet dignity of someone who repaired what he owned rather than replaced it. The room's energy transformed. What had once been laughter hardened into silence. What had been certainty dissolved into doubt. People straightened in their seats, not out of command, but out of instinct, as if respect were returning to its rightful place. Kofi took the microphone with steady hands. He did not smile. He did not bow. He simply stood, grounded by the years that had taught him how fragile dignity could be when judged by appearance. He thanked the foundation not for recognition, but for the work they did. He spoke of communities that did not need charity as a spectacle, but partnership as a practice. He reminded the room that generosity performed for applause often loses its soul, while generosity performed in silence can change lives without announcing itself. As he spoke, faces softened. The distance between the polished and the worn narrowed. People began to see the contradiction they had created. They had laughed at the image of poverty while celebrating the impact of compassion rooted in lived experience. The room's earlier amusement now felt out of place, like a joke told at the wrong time. Amari's eyes burned. The memory of her whispering laughter returned to her with painful clarity. She had once believed that leaving her past behind meant leaving people behind. Watching Kofi stand under lights meant for those she admired, she realized that she had misread the map of success. He had not escaped the world they came from, he had carried it with him and transformed it into purpose. When Kofi finished, the room stood. The standing ovation was not immediate, but when it began, it spread like a wave that could not be stopped. Chairs shifted. Hands met in applause that grew louder not because it was rehearsed, but because it was earned. People who had smirked earlier now rose with faces etched in respect. The poor man who entered unnoticed had become the center of a room that could no longer pretend it did not need the lessons he carried. Kofi met the applause with quiet composure. He did not absorb it as validation. He accepted it as acknowledgement long overdue, not just for himself, but for those who never received such rooms, such lights, such chances. In that moment, the chandeliers did not shine brighter than his presence. The room did not elevate him, he elevated the room by forcing it to confront the limits of its own judgment. And as the applause continued, one truth settled into the hearts of those standing: respect that rises only after revelation is respect that must be relearned. The applause had barely settled when Kofi's calm authority began to shift the dynamics of the evening. Conversations restarted, but the tone had changed. Guests who had earlier whispered behind the glow of chandeliers now spoke in careful admiration. The laughter that once circled the room, meant to diminish his presence, had evaporated entirely. He had not needed to shout, to boast, or to assert himself. Presence alone, built on years of integrity and perseverance, had rewritten how everyone in the room perceived him. Amari Ndlovu could not stop staring. Her mind raced through years of memory, every small moment she had overlooked or dismissed about Kofi now burning bright in her mind. She remembered the boy who tutored younger children for free, who carried water for neighbors without complaint, who dreamed of a future beyond poverty but had never spoken of entitlement. She had laughed at him once, thinking him naive, small and powerless. Now she realized she had been the one who was naive, believing that appearances and comfort defined worth. Kofi moved through the room with measured steps, acknowledging organizers, nodding to familiar faces, yet never breaking the quiet dignity that seemed to wrap around him like armor. Each smile he returned was gentle, not condescending. Each handshake was firm, deliberate, a reminder that respect is earned, not given by the superficial measures of wealth or status. He paused near the refreshments where a few early doubters tried to engage him, their voices uncertain. He answered politely, but he did not pander. He allowed his achievements to speak louder than any words could. The murmurs around the room began to swell. Guests compared what they had assumed to be true about him with the reality before their eyes. How could the boy they had laughed at have built something so extraordinary without them noticing? How had he remained humble, steady and strong while they chased accolades and applause for far less meaningful contributions? Questions began to unsettle egos and force reflection. Some felt shame, others admiration, but all felt a shift they could not ignore. Amari's chest tightened as Kofi's gaze, steady and calm, met hers across the room. For a moment, the noise of the party fell away. She saw not just the man, but the journey he had taken, nights of struggle, mornings of persistence, years of patience, and the unshakable faith in his own abilities. She felt the weight of her own judgments, the mistakes of dismissing love, and the laughter that once seemed harmless now pressed on her conscience like a heavy stone. The host called for a final round of recognition, naming the top contributors of the foundation. As Kofi stepped forward, applause broke again, louder, more heartfelt. It was no longer polite, it was earned. And in that room filled with wealth, it was Kofi, the man they had underestimated, who commanded respect through integrity, not title. Amari felt something shift inside her. She realized that Kofi's success was not just financial or societal, it was moral. He had triumphed not by taking shortcuts, not by seeking approval, but by holding on to the values that others had long forgotten. And she knew deep in her heart that she had been wrong to laugh. As the night drew toward its close, guests began to leave with hushed conversations about lessons learned, lives changed, and respect reclaimed. The man they had mocked minutes earlier had done more in an hour than many would accomplish in a lifetime. People walked out of the hall carrying the reminder that appearances deceive, humility can conceal power, and laughter can become regret when truth stands before you. Kofi remained near the stage, quiet, reflective. He watched the chandeliers flicker as the last guests departed. He did not revel in triumph. He did not savor embarrassment of those who had doubted him. He simply acknowledged the moment with the calmness of someone who had waited patiently for life to show its true measure. That night, the ballroom no longer belonged to the rich or the powerful, it belonged to the man who had never stopped believing in himself. And somewhere in that room, Amari Ndlovu understood, painfully and finally, that the boy she once ignored, dismissed, and laughed at had become a man she could never underestimate. The ballroom, once alive with laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses, had settled into a quiet reverence. The echoes of applause that had greeted Kofi now seemed to linger in every corner, as if the chandeliers themselves had absorbed the lesson of humility and patience. People left slowly, whispering to one another about the man they had underestimated, recalculating their assumptions, reflecting on the ease with which they had judged him by the clothes he wore, the shoes he wore, and the quiet demeanor he carried. Amari Ndlovu lingered near the back, unable to leave. She felt a storm of emotions, awe, shame, regret, and a strange warmth of inspiration that she could not name. The girl who had once dismissed Kofi, thinking him small and powerless, now understood the magnitude of the man before her eyes. He had transformed hardship into strength, struggle into opportunity, and humility into authority. She realized that wealth and status could be inherited, flaunted, and performed, but respect born from perseverance could not be imitated. Kofi, standing by the stage, allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Years of quiet struggle, of long nights and early mornings, had led him here. He had endured laughter, sneers, and invisibility, yet never let bitterness define him. Tonight was not about revenge, nor about proving superiority. It was about showing the truth, that life rewards resilience, character, and integrity far more than appearances or temporary power. He had become a living proof that patience and hard work, combined with humility, carry weight that cannot be ignored. As the last guests departed, Kofi noticed Amari approaching, hesitant yet composed. She did not speak immediately, and when she did, her voice was calm but layered with emotion. She apologized, not with excuses, not with flattery, but with honesty. She admitted that she had misjudged him, that she had laughed without understanding, and that she had failed to recognize the value of patience and perseverance. Kofi listened quietly, his expression gentle, almost forgiving. There was no triumph in his eyes, only acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said simply. "We all make mistakes. We all misjudge people. What matters is what we do after." Those words resonated with Amari, echoing deeper than she expected. She realized that laughter at someone else's expense was not harmless, it was a choice, a reflection of one's own insecurities. And when life forced truth to reveal itself, the consequences of that choice could be humbling. In the weeks that followed, the story of Kofi Mensah spread beyond the walls of the Grand Marembe Hotel. Articles celebrated his contributions, social media buzzed with admiration, and young people in his community looked up to him as an example of what persistence and integrity could achieve. The man they had laughed at became a symbol, not of wealth, but of character, of quiet power that demanded recognition without demanding attention. Amari, too, changed. She began to reconsider her priorities, understanding that the pursuit of approval, status, and superficial success could never replace the lessons of courage, patience, and authenticity. She volunteered with local programs, investing her time in causes that aligned with values rather than appearances. Each day became a small act of redemption, a way to honor the lessons she had learned that night and to grow into someone who would recognize potential rather than mock it. Kofi, meanwhile, continued his work with humility and purpose. He did not flaunt his success, he did not seek the applause that had already come. Instead, he focused on impact, quietly transforming lives, building opportunities, and showing that true strength is measured by how one uplifts others, not how one dominates a room. And as for the guests of that fateful night, many never forgot the lesson. They had laughed when a poor man entered the party, but they stood when truth and integrity demanded respect. And in that act, they learned a lesson they could not unlearn: appearances deceive, laughter can blind, but patience, perseverance, and character reveal a power far greater than any wealth or title ever could. The man in worn shoes had walked in quietly, and by the time he left the room, he had changed not just perceptions, but hearts.